The motel room stank of cigarettes and sweat. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting sharp shadows on the walls. A man lay slumped on the bed, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Across the room, Aileen Wuornos, a woman with a hard face and eyes that carried both fire and emptiness, held a revolver steady in her hand. Her breath came in short bursts, her finger trembling against the trigger. "You don't know what I've been through," she whispered, almost to herself. Then the shot exploded, deafening in the tight space. The man's body jerked violently, then fell still. The silence that followed was suffocating. Aileen stared at what she had done. Her hand shook, the revolver slipping slightly in her grip. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, her lips curled into something halfway between a grimace and a smile. The room was now still, except for the faint buzzing of the flickering bulb above. Outside, the sound of a car rolling by echoed faintly through the thin motel walls. This was no accident. This was no one-time crime. It was the start, or perhaps the continuation, of something darker. And as the hours passed, the world outside had no idea a serial killer had just claimed another victim. But how does a woman end up here, alone in a cheap motel room, standing over a dead man? What turns a person into someone capable of pulling the trigger again and again, until the line between survival and murder is blurred? The story doesn't start here, but this is the point where everything snapped. And it wouldn't be the last time. The night was cool in Volusia County, Florida. Police sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, chasing down a different crime, but none of the officers yet knew the horror trail that was just beginning to spread. Aileen left the motel, slipping into the driver's seat of the man's car. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her pulse racing. Ing like thunder in her ears. She drove fast, headlights slicing through the dark Florida highway. Every mile carried her further from the body, but not from the weight of what she had done. She thought of her childhood, the beatings, the abandonment, the nights spent sleeping in the woods because home was no refuge. She thought of every man who had looked at her as if she was nothing more than something to use and discard. Rage bubbled up like lava, filling every corner of her mind. She had killed before. She would kill again. The truth is, society rarely sees women as predators. When the word killer is spoken, people imagine men. Strong, aggressive, violent men. But Aileen Wuornos shattered that image. Her crimes were vicious, her motives tangled in trauma and survival. She became one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history, and she wasn't alone. Across the country, in a quiet Sacramento neighborhood, an elderly woman named Dorothea Puente opened the door of her boarding house with a sweet smile that hid deadly secrets. Her victims weren't men in motels. They were the weak, the vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, who trusted her with shelter. Dorothea poisoned them, buried their bodies in her yard, and kept cashing their benefit checks. 2 women. 2 killers. 2 stories that force us to ask, what goes on inside the minds of the deadliest female killers? But before we dive into Dorothea's death house or the motel rooms where Aileen carried out her crimes, we must understand how it all began. Aileen grew up in Michigan, far from the swamps of Florida. She never knew stability. Her mother abandoned her when she was just a child, and her father, violent, troubled, and locked away, was gone from her life completely. Raised by grandparents who often treated her with cruelty, she learned early that the world was harsh, cold, and unforgiving. By the time she was a teenager, Aileen was living on the streets. She survived by trading sex for money, food, or a place to stay. Nights were spent in strangers' cars or hidden corners of the woods. Her body became her only currency, and with it came endless violence. Men saw her as disposable, and she grew to believe she was, too. Every scar, every betrayal, every punch and insult piled onto her shoulders like bricks. By adulthood, the rage inside her was volcanic. So when she pulled the trigger in that motel room, some say it wasn't just about that man. It was about every man who had ever hurt her, every betrayal she had swallowed, every wound that had festered for years. But society didn't see the trauma. Society saw only the crimes. In Sacramento, Dorothea Puente's story unfolded in a different way. She wasn't hardened by a violent street life like Aileen. She built her disguise carefully, like a mask she wore every day. Neighbors described her as kind, helpful, even grandmotherly. She opened her home to those who had nowhere else to go, alcoholics, the homeless, the elderly. She made them meals, gave them beds, and made sure their government checks arrived on time, but behind her carefully pressed dresses and gentle voice lurked a predator. Dorothea had one rule: her tenants rarely left alive. When bodies were later unearthed in her backyard, the shock rippled through the neighborhood. People who had once waved to her across the picket fence could not believe she had buried her victims just steps from where they drank tea together on her porch. The contrast was chilling. Eileen's fury was raw and explosive, while Dorothea's evil was quiet, calculated, hidden beneath lace curtains and polite smiles. As Aileen sped down that Florida highway, the man's car humming beneath her hands, she felt invincible for a moment. No one had stopped her before. No one had cared what she had endured, but cracks were already forming. Witnesses would later remember her face. Police would start finding bodies. The noose was slowly tightening, though she didn't know it yet, and in Sacramento, a gardener was about to dig in Dorothea Puente's backyard, discovering something that would horrify the entire nation. The motel light that flickered above Eileen's victim kept buzzing long after she was gone, like a cruel reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. Somewhere across town, a police radio crackled with calls about unrelated crimes, while the body in that motel bed waited to be found. For Aileen, this was only the beginning of her killing spree. For Dorothea, the mask was about to crack wide open. Two women. Two very different paths. Both deadly, but what drove them to kill? Was it survival, or was it something far darker, and most importantly, how many more would die before the truth came out? The night closed in, silent and heavy. Eileen's car disappeared into the darkness, her face lit only by the dim glow of the dashboard. In Sacramento, Dorothea's neighbors laughed and chatted over dinner, unaware that beneath the ground in her yard, secrets waited to claw their way into the light. The deadliest female killers were moving in the shadows. And soon, the world would know their names, but the question remains: what happens when their masks slip, when the killings can no longer be hidden, when the lies collapse under the weight of truth? The answer is coming, and it starts with a shovel striking the earth. The metal shovel cut through the dirt with a harsh scrape. The gardener paused, wiping his brow under the cool Sacramento sun. Dorothea Puente stood a few feet away, her hands folded neatly in front of her floral dress. Her expression was calm, too calm, as if she were watching someone plant roses instead of digging into her carefully kept yard. The gardener leaned his weight on the handle, pushing deeper. That's when he hit something solid. It wasn't stone. It wasn't root. The sound was wrong, dull, heavy, unyielding. He crouched, brushing dirt away with his fingers. What surfaced wasn't wood or rock. It was pale. Too pale. The man froze. A smell crept upward, sour and unmistakable. His stomach turned, and he staggered back. "Call the police," he whispered. Dorothea's face didn't change. Not a flinch. Not a crack in her grandmotherly mask. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. By the time detectives arrived, the neighbors had gathered behind the fences, their voices low, their eyes wide. This wasn't just another call. This was a discovery that would shake the entire city. Shovels went in one after another. Dirt flew. And then, as the crowd watched, the truth surfaced: human remains. One body. Then another. Then another. The air turned heavy with the sickening realization: Dorothea's quiet boarding house had been hiding a graveyard. The sweet landlady who baked pies and smiled politely over the picket fence had murdered the very people who depended on her for safety. Detectives stared at the unearthed corpses, their gloves stained, their boots sinking into the churned soil. One of them muttered, "How many more are down there?" No one had an answer. Meanwhile, across the country, the Florida police were piecing together a puzzle of their own. The bodies of men were being found: abandoned cars, roadside dumps, motel rooms that smelled of death. The pattern wasn't clear at first, but whispers spread through the force. The killer might not be a man at all. A witness reported seeing a blonde woman driving one of the victims' cars. Another remembered a woman at a roadside bar, drinking heavily, her eyes scanning the room like a predator. Slowly, the image of Aileen Wuornos began to take shape, but even as suspicions formed, she was still out there, moving from town to town, hunting, surviving. Every man who picked her up thought he was in control. They thought she was just another drifter offering companionship for a price. None of them realized that she held the power, that survival and rage mixed in her veins like gasoline waiting for a spark, and when that spark hit, it always ended the same way, with a gunshot echoing through the night. The world wasn't ready for women like this. Society painted killers as men, hulking figures, fists clenched, jaws tight. But Aileen and Dorothea shattered that illusion. They showed another face of evil, one that was harder to see coming. Dorothea hid her crimes in plain sight, feeding her tenants stew at the dinner table, smiling warmly as she signed their checks, forged, stolen, cashed in her name. Aileen carried her violence on the road, a storm that struck without warning, her fury unleashed in motel rooms and deserted highways. Two women. Two methods. One truth, they were predators, and they were not finished. In Sacramento, detectives swarmed Dorothea's home, turning over every inch of the property. The smell of death clung to the yard, to their clothes, to their memories. Each shovel of dirt revealed more horror, until it was clear the yard had become a secret cemetery. The neighbors couldn't stop watching. She looked so normal, one whispered. Like somebody's grandma. Another shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. I used to wave to her every morning. I let her watch my kids once. Behind the yellow tape, Dorothea sat quietly on her porch as police combed through the evidence. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes steady. One detective leaned toward another. She's not shocked, he murmured. She knew this was coming. They were right. She knew exactly what they would find. Back in Florida, Aileen was spiraling. She drank more, fought more, trusted less. With her partner Tyria at her side, she moved through bars and truck stops like a restless ghost. But the bodies she left behind drew attention. Each crime scene tied her tighter to the hunt. Detectives were closing in. They traced stolen cars back to her. Witnesses described her face. One victim had fought back, leaving bruises and marks that told investigators this wasn't a one-time act of desperation, it was a pattern. Aileen felt the net tightening, but anger blinded her. Instead of stopping, she pushed forward. Each killing came faster, the time between shorter. She told herself it was survival. She told herself it was justice. But the truth was darker. She had crossed a line she could never come back from. The media caught wind of both cases. Headlines screamed across the nation, serial killer landlady buried victims in her yard. Highway hunter stalks Florida roads. Americans stare at the faces of these women on their televisions and in their newspapers, struggling to understand. These weren't shadowy men hiding in alleys. These were women, one who looked like someone's grandmother, the other like a broken soul drifting from place to place. Both deadly. Psychologists scrambled to explain it. Trauma. Greed. Psychopathy. Each theory tried to make sense of the senseless, but none erased the fact that the victims were real, their lives cut short by killers no one had expected. In Sacramento, police prepared to arrest Dorothea. But before they could take her in, she smiled sweetly and asked if she could walk down to the hotel on the corner for a cup of coffee. They allowed it, thinking she wasn't a threat. She was an old woman, after all. That was their mistake. Dorothea Puente walked calmly away from her house, crossed the street, and disappeared. By the time the officers realized what had happened, she was gone. A grandmotherly serial killer was now on the run. In Florida, Aileen sat in a bar, staring into her drink. She felt eyes on her, whispers crawling along the walls. The police were closing in, but she didn't know how close. Ever. Time the door swung open, her hand twitched toward her jacket pocket where the revolver waited. Her paranoia grew. She lashed out at strangers, accusing them of betrayal, of setting her up. Tyria began to fear her, realizing the storm inside Aileen was becoming uncontrollable. the streets hummed with rumor. A female killer was out there, armed and dangerous. Every man who picked up a hitchhiker now looked twice, wondering if she was the one who wouldn't let him live to see another sunrise. The shovel had struck the earth in Sacramento. The bodies were being counted. The law was hunting in Florida. 2 stories, 2 trails of blood, moving toward the same inevitable end, capture. But before justice came, more lives were still at risk, and as Dorothea Puente slipped into the city crowds and Aileen Wuornos stared into the bottom of her drink, both women were moments away from their worlds crashing down, because the walls were closing in, and the next knock on the door wouldn't be friendly.